Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a chance to get your coffee or tea or iced tea or something cooler if you're in the heat wave as well. But for those who don't know me, I'm Peter Orford. I'm been asked by Claire and Hugo to MC this section, which means I get to do my best radio DJ impression as we spin some tunes. What I'm here to do today is to summarize what's happened so far for those of you who are just joining us, and also to help to clarify for those who have been with us the whole way through as well. And we've had some fantastic panels so far. In our first panel, we heard about the history of shorthand from Kelly and Tim and Hugo, which is amazing stuff. And I say revolution to me to realize that shorthand has such a long history back to the 16th century, and the way in which it was used not purely as journalism, but also as a communal way of writing between friends as well, for private correspondence too. We really set up Hugo's talk on Dickens and shorthand with an excellent context there. And then we moved on to hear about from curators as well. And it's great to hear a variety of voices there beyond academia. And with the curators, they were showing us various different manuscripts and shorthand texts around the world, which I think often we as researchers might otherwise ignore, thinking shorthand, what can we do with that? But now with this conference, we can realize that these are unmined treasures we can really be looking into, finding more and more out about as well. So there's been lots of discussion about how we can really try to, how we can try to actually expand, to get more people involved with shorthand, both online and in museums as well. And whether we can be doing things like setting up puzzles for people to do, for example, more sort of interactive exercises as well, for people writing in shorthand. Something we mentioned a lot, we're actually writing in shorthand. It's easy just trying to read it all the time as well. Now, while I've been doing this, Lydia has been manning on Twitter. Hello, Lydia. And seeing what's going on in the Twitterverse here too. And I'm before I hand over to Lydia, I'm impressed by the mention someone made of emojis and text speak as a modern day shorthand. And that's very, very much true. I think, again, that's another way into explaining shorthand to a new generation of understanding language in that way. Lydia, what have we been saying on Twitter? What's been the news over there?
So things are going well so far. Can you hear me? Perfect. So we've been tweeting out the first two panels, the panel and the roundtable. We've been putting up media so people can actually see the shorthand, which I think is very important. Those tweets, the ones that have ciphers, appear to be the most popular. People retweet them. They've also heavily retweeted Emily Bell's financial incentive to crack the code for £300, which I think is about 600 US currency. So still great on the side of the Atlantic. I think we need to draw attendees' attention to the hashtag, which is Decoding Dickens. So if you're going to retweet or tweet, if you share that hashtag, it will help keep all conference information in one place. We also have a pinned question, which will happen during each break. Right now we have, what can we do to bring shorthand to life online? This is not a rhetorical question. So if any of you have ideas, Pete, for example, just shared emojis, getting the message out there and making it, using all the tools of the digital age to bring the message to people who might be interested in cracking the code. So keep tweeting, keep sharing, and give us your thoughts on how to make this conference have a wider impact.
Thank you, Lydia. Yeah, I think the two things we can learn from this is that interaction is the key. People like to be able to solve puzzles and get involved there. So the fact that the tweets with the ciphers on are getting more clicks makes sense. Because it's a visual thing people can respond to as well, and they want to try to solve puzzles as well. I think also what we learn is that money works too. So if you offer £300 cash, that always works. So if my boss is listening, that's a very good plan for any motivational tips. Always offer me £300 cash. Okay. It's not coming, is it? Anyway, but never mind. We're going to move on now to our next two panels as the afternoon continues now. So we'll take what we've learned from the first two panels and see now how we can address that in the next panel as well. And chairing the next panel is going to be Emily Bell, who I'm happy to hand over to now. And I think Claire will be introducing as well. So Claire, if you want to start that, and everyone else, I'll see you after the next two panels for the next recap as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete. Thank you so much, Lydia. Great dynamic, guys. What a dynamic duo. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce the chair of our second session, Dr. Emily Bell. Emily is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Leeds on the Leverhulme Trust funded project, the Society of Authors 1884 to 1914, and she has made wide and varied contributions to Dickens studies and digital humanities. As I said at the start, I'm keeping my introductions brief, but do check out Emily's further work in our speaker biographies. But for now, over to you, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and I'm very pleased to be chairing these next two sessions on creative crowdsourcing and on manuscripts and digital scripts. So as Claire did, I'll introduce each speaker very briefly. They'll speak for about 10 minutes and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So our first speaker is Gowan Dawson, who is a professor of Victorian literature and culture at the University of Leicester, and he was co-investigator of the AHRC-funded project Constructing Scientific Communities, Citizen Science in 19th and 21st Centuries. And I'll hand over now to Gowan.
Thank you. I hope I'm going to be able to share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully it's going to work. Come on. Okay, so thank you, Emily, and thank you to Claire and Hugo for inviting me. I'm going to be a very badly behaved panelist, though, and I'm going to decline to use one of the key words in the title of this panel, and that's crowdsourcing. And hopefully it might be clear from my paper why I'm going to decline to use it. So, okay, constructing scientific communities was a large multi-strand project with many partners. I won't name them all, but they're on the slide, that brought together historians and literary scholars working on the Victorian period with scientists. And the project came out of a recognition that if the 19th century information revolution that was enabled by steam-powered machine printing allowed the development of a genuinely popular scientific culture in which ordinary people made important contributions to knowledge, then something comparable was happening in our own times with our own digital revolution. In particular, what we called the ConSci-Com project worked with the citizen science platform Zooniverse, which had grown from a single project in the 1990s to an online platform that now has over 1 million registered volunteers supporting projects in a range of scientific disciplines, particularly in astrophysics. And it's the huge growth of scale in the data sets handled by scientists in our digital age that has created a new need for amateur contributions, as the pattern recognition and classification tasks carried out by volunteers and their ability to identify unusual data cannot, at least at the moment, be replicated by machines. As Zooniverse's motto puts it, the universe is too big to explore without you. There nevertheless remained significant difficulties in bringing professional and citizen scientists together in a mutually beneficial collaboration. At the Leicester end of the ConSci-Com project, we worked on Victorian science periodicals that induced their mass audiences to contribute observations and interpretations, and to feel part of a community of readers and contributors. And we began to wonder if there were any lessons in these periodicals for modern citizen science. To explore this, we devised a new Zooniverse project that we named after the Victorian journal that had most captured our imagination. This was something called Hardwick's Science Gossip. His rather racy title signalled a paradoxical reconstitution of oral speech on the printed page. And this was a key to its appeal to Victorian readers, and it turned out to be really important to us. For our version of Science Gossip, and you can see here, this was the front end of it. We worked with the Biodiversity Heritage Library, or BHL, an open access database of life science publications that contains more than 50 million pages. Within this vast repository, there are over 5 million pages that contain illustrations, and these were a crucial means by which scientific information was disseminated to different audiences, as well as now being of great interest to academics, both scientists and historians. And here are just a couple of examples of that. But with illustrations, there is a problem. While such images are no less valuable than the text and letterpress around them, they cannot be searched for in digitized pages in the same way that words can be picked up by OCR programs. Academics in the humanities have long been aware that we tend to give much more priority and attention to textual rather than visual sources. And this has, I think, been exacerbated by the advent of the large-scale digitization of printed materials. The methods of citizen science, however, afforded a means of providing the sort of metadata for images that can make them searchable. So the users of the Science Gossip platform were presented, and I should say this is a historical project, it's no longer running, but they were presented with digitized pages from a number of Victorian periodicals, and they were asked a set of questions. And this is the kind of screenshot that they would have seen. Are there any illustrations? If so, where are they on the page, and what kind of illustration is it? Does it illustrate a species or genera? Is it an artist? Or is an artist, engraver, or printer attributed? And are there any associated keywords to the image that would help understand either the image or its context? They were also asked to draw identifying rectangles around the images they were tagging. So that was the main task that they were asked to undertake. As with other Zooniverse projects, the data supplied by individual users was compared to that produced by other users to maximize accuracy. And each classification and description had to achieve a consensus of 10 users coming to the same conclusions before it was deemed acceptable. So there was what on Zooniverse they call consensus values, and they could be set at different rates depending on the subject that was being worked on. Keywords, because they reflect more subjective interpretations of the content, were not subject to these same consensus requirements, and that allowed a greater level of kind of individual interpretation. Through these sets of tasks, the Science Gossip platform generated data that could be used for two distinct outcomes. One was to assist the BHL to provide image search functions of their colossal database, thus improving access to its content, while also uncovering images of species that would otherwise have been largely inaccessible to modern botanists and zoologists. And I should say that BHL is first and foremost a scientific database. I work on the history of science and the cultural history of science, and I use it all the time, but actually it's really was set up there for scientists themselves. In this respect, the keywords added to images by Science Gossip users are a particularly valuable form of metadata for scientists trying to find images of species that kind of there just wasn't much visual data about. The second outcome of the platform was to provide historians and other interested parties with a much better sense of the role played by images in Victorian natural history publishing, and in particular, the knotty problem of who was involved in the production of these illustrations. This is data that academic historians on their own would never be able to generate, simply because the database is so vast, but it's information that has made a very important contribution to their research. And I should say here that we had a postdoc working at the Leicester end of the project, who's now published a number of papers on precisely this issue, on visualizing natural history in wood engravings and in lithographs. And he's used extensively the information that was provided by the Science Gossip project. Now, one of the things that we learned from working with the Zooniverse team, who are real experts on citizen science, is that not all citizen science platforms are guaranteed to be a success. Projects that might yield valuable data for professional scientists, but which don't get their citizen volunteers interested and enthused, generally won't get completed and thus can provide only very partial information. It's therefore notable that Science Gossip, one of the things about it was that it really engaged and interested the Zooniverse community, the established Zooniverse community, who had been working for decades on explicitly scientific projects. And I think this is one of the things that we were able to do, was to tap a pre-existing corpus of users. And over 3 years, we attracted more than 8,000 users who between them processed around 200,000 pages, making over 500,000 classifications of illustrations. And I think one of the reasons for this success was that the users of Science Gossip felt they were active participants in the framing and carrying out of new research. And this is my problem with crowdsourcing. They're not merely a source, they were co-creators of knowledge. The term we were told to use is crowd crafting. And one of the reasons that they felt this was the Zooniverse's open source tool known as Talk, which enabled them to engage in conversations about the contents of the journals and the processes involved in tagging the images. And the Talk facility provided a space for discussion, where catering for the immediate desire to communicate upon seeing something that was particularly striking or unusual. Hashtags, collections and filtering allowed more advanced users to collate comments and observe the community's discussions. And our postdoc acted as a moderator, but often as a very light touch moderator. The volunteer participants could also share curious or pathetic finds, such as an illustrated account from the Magazine of Natural History that seems to be about how to surf on the backs of crocodiles. So in the 1820s, this was how you'd be able to go surfing. Volunteers were also integral to developing an improved algorithm that meant that the many unillustrated pages from periodicals, which initially hampered the Science Gossip user experience, could be excluded from the platform, making it much easier and more efficient for volunteers to perform the core task of classifying images. So Science Gossip was actually a very self-reflexive endeavour. After all, citizen scientists were both the researchers and the actual subject of the research. Zooniverse's established community of volunteer citizen scientists were recruited to help us explore the very roots of their own practices in the kinds of journals, including Hardwick's Science Gossip, that deliberately cultivated audience participation. And like Science Gossip, that reconstitution of orality, of the spoken word, either on the printed page or on the digital screen with Zooniverse's Talk facility, I think was really, really integral to developing a sense of community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation and showing us how you use the Zooniverse platform for this. Our next presentation is from Emma Curry and Aine McGriffiths, who are both research fellows at the V&A on the Deciphering Dickens project, which aims to share Dickens's manuscripts with a wider audience through an online interactive digital archive. And I'll hand over to them now.
Super, thanks Emily. So hi everyone, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Deciphering Dickens project and the work that we've undertaken recently. And then Aine is going to talk through some of the activities that hopefully we will have coming up in the future. So we're working together on the project with John Bowen at the University of York and Doug Dodds, who's a senior curator at the V&A. So the project's overall aims are to look in more detail at the museum's collection of Dickens's manuscripts, to find new ways that we can study and share them, and most importantly, as the title says, to try and decipher them. So we want to try and recover the difficult to read deleted passages because we believe they can shed new light on Dickens as an artist and can give rise to new research by revealing the ways Dickens composed and refined his writing in greater detail than ever before. So several Dickensians have highlighted the potential of this approach in their previous work on the manuscripts, so particularly the work of Joel Bratton and Philip Davis, who've shown how Dickens shapes his characters and scenes through very subtle alterations to his phrasing. So the possibilities and range of approaches with this work are vast. But we also hope that the deciphering process will offer an opportunity for the public to gain unprecedented access to these works online and engage not just as audiences, but as active participants in the discovery process. So far we've been using From the Page to transcribe the manuscripts, which is an online crowdsourced transcription software. So this image gives you a little bit of a sense of what the interface looks like when you're transcribing and how you use XML coding to mark the places where there are alterations to the manuscripts. So when we first began the project, the markup tags had to be entered manually, which was quite challenging because we often found that we'd accidentally miss maybe closing a tag, which then creates an error message when you're trying to save your work. Luckily, From the Page have recently upgraded their software so that tags can now be added just by highlighting the text and clicking, which really greatly reduces the possibilities of errors. So the marked up text then looks like this afterwards, with the alterations and insertions made visible. So we've now held several transcription workshops. So Doug and John hosted several in-person events in previous years at the Dickens Universe Conference in California. And we also hosted an online transcribathon in December last year, in which all of our participants were kind of working on their manuscript pages at the same time, with a Zoom room open so that we could discuss what we were working on and help with any queries. So we're also going to take part in the Dickens Universe again this summer, next week, in fact, very excitingly. So the focus this year is A Christmas Carol. So we'll be working in collaboration with the Morgan Museum in New York, who have the manuscript in their collection. So we're hosting 4 transcription workshops over the course of the week. So we're hoping that we might be able to fully transcribe some pages during that time. So now I'll just pass over to Anya to talk about the project's next steps.
These past events have given us a really good sense of what might be possible with these manuscripts, but also the scale of the challenge. So now we're working on a funding bid, which will enable us to take the project into its next phase. We think a good place to begin might be with David Copperfield, one of the best known and best loved of the novels, which we hope will generate both public and academic curiosity. We'll be asking the public and academic community to join in the transcription process, with the ultimate aim in the future of developing a comprehensive online resource for this manuscript, which will host all the images of the manuscript pages, full and searchable transcriptions of all the text and corrections, useful tools to guide participants through the transcription process, including maybe an A to Z of Dickens's handwriting, and a range of supplementary historical and contextual material, including links to other related items in the museum's collections, such as the original illustrations. This is very much a work in progress, and we're currently discussing ways of opening up the transcription process that will strike a balance between making the full manuscript available for the public benefit and interest, but that also galvanize participants to solve the most intractable puzzles. One idea would be to share these as deciphering challenges that people can scroll through, with a comments box for participants to share their transcription ideas. So we thought we'd share a couple of examples of what these might look like with you.
Cool. So the first challenge we've got is taken from the opening page of David Copperfield. So famously, the first line of the novel is, "Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show." So you can see here, hopefully on your screen, on the manuscript, that Dickens initially added a few extra words to this opening sentence, but then deleted them. So far from looking at it, we think we can see "in the," but we can't make out what the third word is. So it'd be great to hear either in the chat or in the Q&A afterwards if anyone has any ideas what this might be. So we think the word possibly begins with S and then ends with one of Dickens's looping letters. So that could potentially be an H or a D or an L or something else. You can also see a longer letter in the middle of the word, so perhaps a P or a G. But then at the same time, if you look very closely, you can see there's also a fold in the paper. So it could be that these words run together, and perhaps it says "in these," and then the final word is shorter. So perhaps "in these pages," which you can see a bit further down in the second line. Next challenge.
So another one, a second example here is from page 3 of the manuscript, describing Betsy Trotwood's husband. So the scribble in the center at the top. So you can just see on the top line, he firstly describes him as very handsome, crosses that out, replaces it with good looking, crosses that out, goes back to handsome. And then we've got except, and then a scribbled out phrase, which seems to say "in the something." It looks like it ends in "ing," maybe "ding," maybe begins with a C, we're not sure. There's a character in the middle, could be an OR together. Again, any suggestions, very gratefully received. So by making the project's discoveries publicly available, we hope to generate creativity and new opportunities for research, as well as giving the public all over the world the opportunity to look at these manuscripts in high definition, to explore for themselves the tangle of additions and deletions and witness the way that these stories were created. We hope that it might also be the case that by deciphering the idiosyncrasies of Dickens's handwriting and refining the process of seeing beneath his deletion marks, that we may generate useful ideas for other projects working with handwritten manuscripts, or indeed discover some common ground. We're excited to note that we share some things in common with Dickens Code, not least a focus on material to be revealed or decoded, and a desire to open up the process of doing so. The V&A has a few pages of Dickens's shorthand in its wider Dickens collection, and if we do launch with David Copperfield, perhaps there'll be an interesting connection with David's attempts to learn shorthand and make a success of himself as a parliamentary reporter. We are currently developing a set of research questions that will guide our project as it moves forwards. The British Library's Collective Wisdom Report has been a really useful resource for bringing to mind some of the potential challenges and opportunities. So, for example, we will be asking, how can we host and present the material to ensure its long-term sustainability and potential for growth? How can we involve volunteers in a way that advances the project's aims to decipher as much of the deleted material as possible, but also affords them a meaningful experience? And how can we successfully manage and recognise their contributions? And are there any digital tools or software that could help us to read the obscure material? The next steps of this project, as we mentioned, will be to submit a research grant in the early autumn, which will hopefully enable us to fully launch the project to the public. To finish, if anyone has any ideas for those deciphering challenges that we shared earlier, we'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hopefully people will have a go at deciphering those passages in the chat. So our final speaker in this session is Bob Nicholson, who is a reader in history and digital humanities at Edge Hill University. He works on the history of 19th century popular culture and is also interested in the construction and use of digital archives. And I'll hand over to Bob now.
Hey, can you hear me okay? And is my screen coming through?
Yes.
Excellent, brilliant. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and thank you very much for the introduction. So, yeah, I work on the history of Victorian popular culture, and I'm kind of interested in a whole range of things. But one of the things that I've really been fascinated by in recent years is the history of Victorian comedy, and in particular, joke telling. Now, hopefully, I think, speaking to a room or a virtual room of Dickens enthusiasts, fingers crossed, I'm not going to have to kind of begin by convincing you that the Victorians did actually have a sense of humour and that this old myth about them being not amused isn't true. I think we would certainly say that Dickens knew how to tell a joke or how to make us laugh. What I've been trying to explore, though, is all of the other ways in which the Victorians circulated comedy. And it turns out that actually there's an enormous amount that we still don't know about the kind of jokes people told in the 19th century, how they were written, where they were published. The vast majority of them, aside from maybe the ones in Punch, which tend to get a lot of attention, have not really been explored in a great deal of depth. So rather than think of the Victorians as kind of humourless, I'm instead searching for all of the contexts in which they told jokes. You'll find them in magazines, you will find them in newspapers, not just comic periodicals, but in pretty much every newspaper in the land. You'll find them in dedicated joke books, you'll find them in diaries, you will even find them in shorthand, as it turns out. This is from Pitman's Shorthand magazine. If you want to see the translation of this and see more of them, Catherine Baird over on Twitter often posts these Victorian comics in which the caption is presented in shorthand. So I'm interested in these jokes. I'm interested in what they tell us about the 19th century and the kind of social and cultural role that joke telling played. The challenge, though, for me and indeed for anybody who might want to research the history of joke telling, is that they're really hard to find. I said earlier that they were published in their millions or in their thousands in the 19th century. There's no shortage of them, but actually locating them is tricky. They're scattered around chaotically, printed as column fillers, smuggled away into the margins of other texts, scribbled on the back of postcards. They haven't survived in any kind of systematic way. You can't just go into an archive or to the British Library and say, hey, show me all of your jokes. So what I've been working on for a few years now, on and off, bit by bit, it's been a sort of this long and gradual road, is this, the Old Joke Archive. a digital archive that aims to solve that very problem, to find jokes, not just from the 19th century, not just from Britain, but from all historical periods and places, and gather them together in a place where we can explore them more systematically and preserve what are actually very ephemeral texts, very fragile texts that often survive by accident, in, hopefully, a more permanent and accessible form. The old joke archive hasn't been launched yet, so yeah, don't try and Google it just yet. We're still doing the kind of behind the scenes stuff. And I was kind of hoping we might have launched our pilot by the time we did this conference, but hey, the virus and everything has kind of set us back a bit while we work on teaching and other things. But I thought today what I can show you is a bit of behind the scenes at the interface we're beginning to develop, at the process for ingesting jokes into the archive. And I should say the prototypes I'm about to show you, a lot of it's still very much work in progress. There's a lot of little sort of visual bugs and fonts that we need to work on, but it'll give you a flavour of hopefully what you can enjoy in the coming months. So there are some challenges involved in this, and they're slightly different to the ones involved in some of the projects we talked about earlier. I mean, I suppose with some Victorian jokes, particularly their more obscure puns, there is a degree of decoding and trying to figure out, what on earth did this mean? Mostly, though, it's actually more practical issues. So the first challenge is finding them, and I've spent a long time researching the history of comedy, and so I've certainly located plenty of sources, but they are so dispersed that there is no way that one person could ever just locate them in any kind of comprehensive way. It's a project that requires many people who might spot them by accident, joke detectives as we're calling them maybe, who will hunt them down in other archives. There is then the challenge of extracting them, because in most cases jokes are not printed in dedicated publications, but as column fillers or alongside other forms of text. We don't want to pull in, let's say, news reports, sports reports, fashion columns into our archive. We simply want to ingest the jokes. So there is the challenge of extracting them from other texts. Then, broadly speaking, we have the challenge of annotation, of transcribing them, of describing them, of giving them the kind of metadata that would be useful. Because the great advantage, of course, of having an archive devoted to a subject, whether it be jokes, whether it be a particular type of letter or image, is that you can choose your own metadata that best allows people to search comedy. So we might think in terms of the subject of jokes, of the format of jokes. So we need to find ways to do that. And finally, we need to make sure that they're presented in a way that allows people to explore them. So there's a range of technical and curatorial and historical challenges here that we're thinking through and trying to puzzle out. This is a project I'm working on with other historians and computer scientists. So let me show you a little bit about what we've done. This is a kind of just very basic mock-up of the front page where hopefully you'll be able to search, to browse jokes and see kind of jokes presented, just to kind of draw you in. But let me show you the kind of process for adding material and how users will eventually interact with it. At the moment, what we've built is a kind of expert workbench, and this is for largely people involved in the project. So hopefully if we get funding, it'll be a postdoc and it'll be some of my students at Edge Hill University. A simpler version of this, more in line with what Zooniverse do, will be made available for members of the general public. But firstly, there's a way for people to add source data. So if you find a joke floating around in a magazine, maybe you're not even looking for it and you just spot it, you can just go and contribute it to the old joke archive, providing, of course, that the underlying image is out of copyright and is available for reuse. If it's not, we'll have to kind of deal with that internally and just present a transcription. So in this case, as an example, I uploaded a joke column from Lloyd's weekly newspaper, typical jokes of the day that would appear every week. Lloyd's was one of the best-selling papers of the late 19th century. So we upload a whole column, and then users are presented with this kind of workbench that has several stages. So firstly, a bit like we saw earlier, and a bit like with Zooniverse, you can draw boxes around individual jokes, which allows us to segment them out. We don't want to present them as a full column, but as individual jokes. That's the kind of unit of our archive. Now, this is a much thicker box than in the real version, but just so you can easily see it, users might be presented with a page from a joke book or from any other book, a column from a newspaper, and they can draw boxes around the jokes and say, yeah, I think that is a joke. It's actually not always entirely obvious in the 19th century, particularly for non-expert eye. But you can do that for a whole column. Sometimes they'll all be jokes. Sometimes jokes will be nestled in among other things. Once that's processed, you can see the actual clippings start to appear automatically in that central column, and then they can be processed individually. On the right-hand side is where the annotation begins. So Everything that's uploaded is initially OCR'd, so we get automatic optical character recognition. But as anybody who's ever worked with this will know, the accuracy of it is incredibly patchy and in many cases almost unusable. Jokes, really frustratingly, often tend to be printed on the edge of a page, so often right by the gutter of a page where they bend over to the side and you lose a little bit of that legibility. So on the right-hand side, people can correct that annotation and they can begin to correct that transcription and then begin to annotate it. So you can see, they're quite faint, but you can see we've drawn here a little box around the title, which is just old and crusty for this joke. But here I've drawn a box around the name of a character, the fussy old director, and then the user is prompted to tell us a bit about that character. What can we infer from the joke? What might be their age? In this case, actually I should have filled that in, it would be adult or elderly. Their gender, maybe their social class, their job. And in many cases, those things won't be signaled directly by a keyword, but you can kind of pick it up from reading the joke. This is adding the kind of material that I think would be really useful to historians. If you're wanting to find jokes about certain types of people, certain types of topics, this really, I think, enriches that data. And so you can go through all that, and there's various other things. You can tag bits of speech. You can tag the attribution at the bottom. You can see this was originally clipped from Judy magazine, a rival to Punch. And you can kind of go through all of this and add all of this data. And this is the end result. Again, a lot of the sort of fonts and text here just need a little bit of playing around with, but it's working. You can see the transcription. The bottom one on the left is what the OCR was, so it gives you a flavour of just how bad it was. I mean, that's a code to decode, isn't it? But you can see above that, we have the transcriptions. We're going to be inviting users to transcribe these jokes multiple times, again, to check for errors, to check for kind of disagreements and interpretations. But you can see that it credits the person who transcribed it too. So again, I'm hesitant to use words like crowdsourcing. I'm much more keen to think of these people as collaborators and researchers working on a project. And we want to make sure people get credit for finding or transcribing that joke. And then you can see on the right-hand side, all of that metadata appears. All of this will be fully searchable using the archives interface. So it's a fairly straightforward, I think, annotation and transcription platform that we've built to deal with the particular type of material that we want to. Initially, we actually had a much more high concept and complicated system where we would sort of have people transcribing and annotating a joke, and it dynamically generated a comic strip in Victorian style based on the joke. And we thought that might inspire people to do stuff, be a bit more creative. In the end, we could never quite get that working as well as we wanted. And when we ran some user tests, we found that people just preferred the simple version. They liked interacting with the original text. They enjoyed the process of transcribing and annotating it. And all the other stuff we were adding to try and gamify or make it more exciting actually wasn't needed. The pleasure was in the original document. Finally, the other key element of our project has been the use of social media. So even though we've only sort of done very sort of small tests of transcription so far, what I've been building over the last few years is an existing community of people who I think will be interested in this. So every day we currently tweet a Victorian joke at Victorian Humour, and also on Facebook. And across those two platforms, we now have about 25,000 people following us. When the archive's ready to roll out, these daily jokes will be ones that are untranscribed. So there'll be a little link saying, transcribe this joke if you want. And I'm hoping that's going to drive users to the archive too. So that's the old joke archive. I'm hoping if we can get a little bit more funding and you know, I have a bit more time away from teaching and admin and all the things that we've been doing during the pandemic, I'm really optimistic we'll have this launch within the next year. So keep your eye out for jokes, and if you would like to get involved in the project at any time, we're always really looking for both researchers, volunteers, or anybody who's interested in what might have made people laugh in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. We've got about 5 minutes, I think, before the next session is scheduled to start. So please do type questions into the chat. We've had one from Hugo already for the Deciphering Dickens project. He says he's really looking forward to your insights and is interested in whether the longhand shapes of Dickens's writing are influenced by the shorthand shapes. So do you have any thoughts on that? Have you spotted any kind of correlation between the terribleness of Dickens's handwriting in those manuscripts and the difficulties of the shorthand?
I don't think we've got to that stage yet, but I think that's definitely something that we could explore once we start delving into the text a bit. I don't know, Emma, have you spotted anything? Anything obvious? Something else?
Yeah, I was just thinking it would be great to kind of go through and compare, because some of the kind of loops on Dickens's letters seem so kind of idiosyncratic that I feel like there must be a connection there between that and the shorthand. So yeah, it'd be great to kind of, if we're able to sort of construct our Dickens alphabet, if we can put that alongside the shorthand alphabet and sort of do a comparison. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I had a question about the platforms used. So sort of for Bob initially, but I'd be interested in people's reflections on how they chose the kind of platform they're using. So Bob, could you tell us a little bit more about the creation of the archive and the content management system and that kind of thing?
Yes, I mean, not a great deal of detail because this has all been handled by my colleague in computer science, Mark, who's been building it. But yeah, we made a very conscious decision to build our own, initially because we were trying to do something quite playful and creative with it. And that didn't seem like the kind of thing that would be a kind of general purpose tool that could be used. I think now what we're doing is much closer to what Zooniverse does, drawing box around things, describing data. So in hindsight, we probably actually could have integrated with their platform. And I'm still kind of wondering whether it's worth us kind of reverting back to that. And because of their existing community of users, it might be a sensible thing. So I'm still kind of wondering about that. But yeah, it does give us plenty of power in terms of controlling the flow of how people use it and of being able to really design something. That wasn't something I could have done on my own. So I'm really fortunate that I've got a colleague in computer science who works in the digital humanities who's interested in designing interfaces and how users interact with this data. So for him, this is interesting research to see, whether it works or not. So yeah, it's kind of fully bespoke really in this case. And I do have reservations about that in terms of its longevity and what happens if my computer science friend loses interest in Victorian comedy. So there are issues there with using something that way that I'm umming and ahhing about, but everything we produce will be in an open format that can be reused in another system if needs be. So we've been very conscious about that it isn't tied to this one platform.
Thank you. And yeah, also in terms of the audience considerations, because you had this audience built up already, you didn't need the benefits of the Zooniverse platform in quite the same way, perhaps. But Gowan, would you like to talk a bit about how you decided on Zooniverse as a platform?
Yeah, so, I mean, we were already working with Zooniverse as one of the partners with the project. So it was very much begun working with their computer scientists. And they had this established model that has kind of worked extremely well in a number of science projects. And they were very keen to test it out on humanities. And I think this is an area that they want to, I don't work with Zooniverse anymore, so I can't really speak with them, but I think they see kind of their methods as the next or one of the next frontiers being the humanities. And one of the things that they were doing at the very end of the project, so I can't really speak to this in an up-to-date way, was that they were getting lots of people with projects approaching them saying, can you work with us? And in the end, it became rather overwhelming. So they kind of devised a toolkit, which I think they call Panopto, which allows projects to essentially kind of syndicate a Zooniverse kind of platform and model of the sort that Bob was kind of talking about. And my understanding is that is available. I think they have certain kind of requirements that you're going to use it in appropriate ways. But I think they very much kind of see that they have this model that works, that has kind of certain accessibility thresholds that allows archiving as well. And they're quite keen to roll that out as far as it will go.
Thank you. And that kind of touches on a question from Claire, which is about accessibility as well. And she says this is something she's finding quite tricky in thinking about how to present shorthand. And I think it's tricky anyway when you have digitized images that you're asking for people to engage with. But I wonder if Emma and Anya, you could talk about this in terms of from the page, because it sounds like the way they've updated the platform makes it more accessible in that you don't need to get to grips with coding in the same way. But do you have anything to add in terms of accessibility?
I suppose one of the things we really want to add ourselves is what Emma mentioned before, things like Dickens alphabets and sort of supplementary materials that will help people get into it as quickly as possible so that they don't have to spend a really long time, months getting to grips with what his handwriting sort of looks like, but also not presenting necessarily just an entire manuscript and saying, here you go, that of course we would like to do that at the same time, but also a bit like what you've described in the other talks, having little kind of bite-sized pieces, you know, things that you can tag in a box so people could engage with a lot or just a little, depending on how much time or what kind of technology you're using, which we hope will make it more accessible to basically as many people as would like to take part.
Thank you.
And we've been really lucky with them, from the page as well, in that they're very receptive to kind of feedback, and so all of their users kind of they take on board. So I think the kind of change from sort of manually tagging things to now having the functionality to do that automatically was kind of drawn on sort of experience from participants. So it's a really good platform for that.
I could just briefly add that, again, kind of working with the people at Zinverse, one of the things they were thinking about towards the end of our project was the way that people would be contributing less and less on PCs and more on their phones, and having to make the projects and the platforms accessible so that, as Emma says, you kind of dip in and you do a little bit of this, but you actually do it maybe whilst you're commuting, in the old days when we did commute, but on phones and smaller devices, and that you have to take that into account in terms of what you're asking people to do and the platforms that you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, we'll take one final question before we move on to the next session. There are some other questions in the chat, so if speakers do have time, they can have a look at them. But I think this is an important one from Mel Evans, which is about the afterlives of projects. So whether they've been recently concluded or you're planning for the future. Do you see public engagement and this crowd crafting idea as limited to the project lifespan only? And I suppose part of the reflection here is the editorial process of approving transcriptions or moderating and even advertising. So is this crowdsourcing or crowd crafting and collaborative process limited to the lifespan of the project, or is it something open-ended?
I mean, I guess I can say for the Old Joke Archive project is that I don't really see this as a project that will ever end, in the sense that I think we want to expand beyond the 19th century, beyond Britain. And so my plan is to see it as a project that just builds incrementally. So we might hopefully get funding to do something with a certain corpus of Victorian jokes. I hope then I might be able to work with somebody, you know, who maybe wants to work on 18th century France or something like that, and then add stuff in. So ideally, we're trying to build a platform that can go on long term and that could be passed on and inherited if I didn't want to continue with it, though I'm hoping that I can. So I'm hoping it doesn't necessarily finish in that sense. The end I'm more worried about is if we run completely out of funding and we can't host it anymore. I'm trying to get commitments from universities and things to commit to really long term, just keeping it alive. Because otherwise I don't think you can really ethically ask people to provide labour and data if something isn't going to survive. So that is always a dilemma. I think worst case scenario, we've been working closely with the British Library, so the afterlife of it would be a kind of open data set of all the material that people could do something with, even if the archive itself and its interface dies. But no, I'm hoping it will just tick along forever if it works.
So with us, it was very much defined by the life scale of the project, which came to an end in 2018. So an open source database has been created as part of the broader Zooniverse platform. And I think their model is not to keep things open forever, but to actually work through a particular data set. So, I mean, potentially we could have gone on forever because there are so many 19th century journals and science books with illustrations. But our model was very much to take a sample of that, to see what we could do with the data, and then to have that as a discrete thing that comes to an end, but is appropriately archived.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to our three speakers for some really interesting presentations. And there are some comments in the chat. We'll start our next session now.